All right, so today we are going to cover the Latinos in the Gilded Age in the industrial era. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to share the Gilded Age assignment from my U.S. history class, and note right that this is the time of the Second Industrial Revolution, whereby the United States largely became industrially self-sufficient and producing its own consumed goods primarily. Let's see here, 79.6% increase in the number of companies engaged in manufacturing, a 56.6% increase in the number of workers that they employed. Also, let's see here, the gross national product, the value of goods that were produced in the country went up exponentially during this time period after the Civil War to the turn of 1900, basically. That I'll use those terms industrial era and Gilded Age interchangeably. All right, and so you have the evidence of, let's see here, I'm going to jump to number 2. Karl Marx contending that capitalism is an unfair and rigged economic system for the rich. And so the big guys, right, so the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, they were able to get enough loans and have enough capital to play with at the beginning of their ventures, or soon pretty quickly, and they're able to outproduce and stream. They were able to streamline their production to make it more cheap and more efficient, so that they could outproduce their competitors and undersell them in price. Okay, so they could afford to sell their product at a lower price than could their smaller competitors when they crunched their numbers and their overhead and what they had to pay out and what they had in capital to play with. When you're limited in that fashion, you could only go so low with your prices of your products, and the robber barons could go lower and undersell you. And then they began to combine some of their resources, the famous Lakeshore deal for Rockefeller, in which he received like a, let's see here, offered only $1.65 per barrel versus $2.40 per barrel for all other customers, and providing a certain quantity, an incredible quantity, 60 carloads of refined oil per day. So it was a win-win situation for the railroads and the storage companies, because they could charge per pound, and they were promised a lot of pounds from Rockefeller, but he got a rebate that no one else did. And so you get these instances in which, you have a lack of enforcement mechanisms in our capitalist economy compared to today during the late 1800s. Now we have the Clayton Antitrust Act, and it specifies things that big companies cannot do in combining their strength to gobble up the smaller competitors. And so that wasn't around yet. Not until the Sherman Act of 1890, and even then that was very weakly, vaguely articulated and weakly enforced. And so they ran with that ambiguity, these robber barons, and they began gobbling up a lot of other companies. So you have the reality of concentration of wealth and horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is a few corporations gobbling up all their competitors and taking over the entire industry. So Rockefeller with oil, Carnegie with steel, Duke with tobacco, etc. McCormick with agricultural equipment. And yeah, so it was quite a time for big business. It really took off with mechanization of production, with machine production, with electric power, as well as still steam power for a little bit longer. And you look at the coreless machine, which could power hundreds of machines at one time. You look at the hydraulic and pneumatic drills for mining. You look at the mechanical reaper and thresher and harvester combine for farming. But the problem is the average person can't afford those things. So again, as they say, sometimes it takes money to make money. Those who already had these public corporations in which, thousands, if not more, people around the world were buying stock and giving them money to play with. For the smaller guys, there was no competition. You also had the fact that the big guys could afford research and development. And with research and development, they were able to, again, streamline production, improve the production process, improve the quality of their goods so that they not only could sell their goods at a cheaper price and in much higher quantity, but they could also provide a product that was superior in quality. So, of course, what's the consumer to do? The consumer is going to buy the better quality, cheaper product and help enrich the robber barons, the leaders of the industries at this time. So number 2 is conflict history in this U.S. history handout. A lot of it comes from Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the U.S. He has a chapter called Robber Barons and Rebels. And he has good data on wealth concentration during this time. You have the Bessemer process for making steel, but only if you're wealthy and well-connected enough and could find the scientists and the engineers to utilize that process and get the famous Bessemer ovens, etc. And so again, just a few people enjoyed a big advantage over the small entrepreneurs, the small company owners. So it looked as if what Karl Marx had written in negative fashion about capitalism were coming true in the mid to late 1800s, that the capitalist class of big business owners was getting numerically smaller and smaller and more dominant over entire industries, right? So this is happening amongst Anglo-Americans, amongst just, Americans who had immigrated as early as the time as Jamestown or the Pilgrims. And so when you add the component of racism, it's going to make it even worse for those at the bottom, like with Latinos. So let's see here. Notice right here, at the turn of the century, the average income for the American worker was $400 to $500 a year, below the $600 a year figure widely considered the minimum for a reasonable level of comfort. So most Americans were making subsistence wages, not even enough to live off of. And so then you have the problem, especially amongst immigrants and ethnic minorities, whereby they're going to need their wives, their children, no matter how patriarchal their culture were, they had to rely upon the young ladies, the boys, to help contribute to family income. So they took their kids out of school and had them work in a myriad of positions that would constitute what Marx would call the proletariat, the industrial era's manual laborers. And of course, with that, right, with a menial job in the proletariat, it's implied that you're going to work your bottom off. It's going to be backbreaking work. You're not going to be remunerated or paid for it sufficiently to live, much less live well. There's not much promise and advancement as far as making yourself advance up the chain of command at your corporate or whatever employer place. And so it's not an enviable position to be in the proletariat at this time. There were no minimum wage laws, at least not national. The workers' compensation, if you were to get hurt, unemployment insurance if you were to get laid off, none of that. There were no safety net measures, at least at the national level. And so very, very precarious times for those who are at the bottom. And Howard Zinn says that the top 1% controlled like 40% of the country's wealth and assets, over 40%. So you have Carnegie, Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt was a railroad tycoon. J.P. Morgan was into banks and loans and then got his hands in electricity and railroads. Jay Gould was the master wizard at the stock market. But they had a lot of money, a lot of money and access to levers of power, if you will, to enrich themselves. All right. And then, of course, you have here a defense of them, and they were oftentimes very shrewd, very diligent, right? Very hardworking. They sometimes dropped their prices once they gained a virtual monopoly in their industry, which they didn't have to do, but they claim to have done so out of, like with Rockefeller, et cetera, out of humanitarian purposes. But nevertheless, they were vilified in the press by the progressives that we're going to get to soon. The progressives vilified them in the newspapers and in their writings. Let's see here. Then when number 4 is the suggestion that the federal government sided with the robber barons instead of helping the underdogs, if you will, in the nation's economy, that they were very lax and very hesitant to punish big business, to regulate big business. They allowed all this wealth concentration to transpire. Just in one small span of the 1880s, like 1,600 companies merged into 250. I mean, there were a lot of mergers that went against the will of the smaller guys that were getting gobbled up by the big corporations. In the West, in particular, the big wealthy corporations came in as far as, and I'll go ahead and, so I'll put this up, okay? I don't think I have it up yet, but I'll put this up as subsequent reading to give you context to the Gilded Age, to the industrial era. And you see that political cartoon, that's organized labor or the populists. Perhaps I can't recall, but one of the two represented organized labor, obviously the proletariat, the factory workers, the miners, the railroad workers, etc. The populists represented cash crop farmers who were small scale and who couldn't compete with the big corporate farmers and ranchers. So it's one of those two. And see, he's on this emaciated donkey trying to take on the trusts, the big robber barons that you see there with the big iron horse, you know, represented by nothing better than the railroad as far as being emblematic of the domination of wealth and big business. And we've gone over a little bit of that with the railroads, all the land they received from the federal government. They were highly subsidized. They had the right of way on their paths of their tracks and kicked off poor squatters and farmers, etc. So it just looks like a very Darwinian sad story of the big bullies having their way with everybody beneath them on the socioeconomic scale. All right. So then now I'm going to go to our assignment. All right. Jasmine, it's nice to have you. Let's see here. All right. So as you see here, according to Rodolfo Acuna, he concludes that the conquest of the Mexican Far West made most Spanish Mexicans or Spanish speaking Mexicans dependent upon wages earned in jobs controlled by Euro Americans or Anglo Americans, right? And so he talks about, he and other Chicano historians mention states like Durango, Chihuahua, Sonora. They sent a lot of immigrants into the American Southwest and California, into Texas and Arizona, New Mexico, and California during the industrial era. Okay, not to mention there were push factors out of Mexico on account of the Porfiriato. Porfirio Diaz ruled arguably with an iron hand for 30 years over Mexico. And he engaged in a lot of top-down, almost Stalin-like economic explosion with steel, railroads, etc., in the big industries. But it didn't seem to trickle down to the common Mexican person. Kind of like here in the US, it looked like Mexico was a rich man's country that was highly favorable to big business. What made it even more controversial in Mexico was that the big businesses that were granted such concessions were often extranjeros, foreigners, not Mexican themselves. So Porfirio Diaz is begun to be viewed as a bit of a vendido, a sellout to his people for big business, for foreign corporations, etc. So Mexican people in desperation came to the southwestern states. And where do they work? Is oftentimes, as you see here, they worked in mines, corporate mines, on corporate ranches, on corporate farms, and on the railroads. And so, as far as functional history goes, when you look at a demographic and you see how it played a role in the functioning of society, it's quite simple. The Hispanic people engaged in the backbreaking labor that helped these corporations and these industries just thrive, okay, during this time period. But when you look at conflict history, it looks again like Jorge Eber and Arnaldo de Leon in their book Hispanics in the West, that they're not exaggerating when they use the term proletarianization, that the Latino people were pigeonholed into the proletariat and they couldn't get out. And so working in the mines, working on the ranches and the farms, working on the railroads was very hard work. It was not remunerated or paid back very adequately. There were not a lot of opportunities for advancement in any of those major industries. The Mexican people, the Mexican American people also were highly represented in the service sector. So cooks and cleaners, just manual laborers in restaurants and small shops, etc. They were highly represented there. And then it's just not very far, you're getting the origins of coming to the next era where they're going to be highly pigeonholed into commercial agriculture, right? And be working out on the commercial farms. So at any rate, you have places like New Mexico where the Santa Fe ring kind of monopolized all the credit, the ability to get loans to start a business. And the common person, much less common Latino American, did not have much of a choice. And then not only were the overwhelming majority of Latinos in places like Southern Texas relegated to that part of the socioeconomic spectrum, but it says here they also endured relegation to agricultural labor and to being treated as an inferior race, segregated into their own town quarters and refused admittance at restaurants, picture shows, bathing beaches, and so on. And we're going to get further into that in the progressive era as far as outright discrimination and segregation for the Latino people, particularly in the Western states in the progressive era. But here in the Gilded Age, you're already seeing the beginning of that. A dual wage system, like the Chinese suffered. And so doing the same work as Anglo counterparts, but getting paid only a portion as much, and just overtly, there was no hiding it. As far as, like a glass ceiling for women, when they won't admit that women aren't paid the same for the same jobs, they find, justifications and loopholes so that they won't overtly state it. They were overt about it, that the quote Mexicans and the Chinese or Mongolians, as they called them, were an inferior people who did not deserve, and a foreign people who did not deserve the same wages as their Anglo-American counterparts. So you see like this quote with some of their work. To bring the ore to the surface, each worker carried a 200-pound pack strapped to his shoulders and forehead. Their nerves straining and muscles quivering, hundreds of these carriers ascended perpendicular steps in darkness lit by candles on the walls. Emerging into the daylight at the entrance of the mine, they deposited their burdens into cars and then took time to smoke their cigarros before descending again. Does not sound like an enviable daily job. And then it says here, right, Acuna says that mechanization gave farm corporations an edge in the production of cash crops such as cotton. Small farmers could not because they did not have the capital to mechanize. In agriculture, use of machines like the mechanical reaper, thresher, combine incredibly sped up and cut costs for production, thus enabling their corporate farmers to outsell their competitors at a lower price, rendering small-scale cash crop farmers little chance to compete utilizing handheld farm implements. And then when the Latino people tried to unionize, the Knights of Labor was one of the country's biggest unions. The American Federation of Labor, they were not granted a warm welcome into the major unions of the country out of racism. And so that didn't work well. They tried to unionize amongst themselves. If you look up the Anaconda copper mines in Arizona and in Montana, they employed a lot of Hispanic laborers, and they would engage in strike from time to time, but it didn't go well for them as far as their fight within the system to take care, to ensure that they could have subsistence wages and not as dangerous conditions as they were suffering from. And then you had your Robin Hoods like Juan Cortina or Chano Cortina, the Gorras Blancas, the white hats, whereby they would go and take back their cattle. They would cut through the barbed wire fences of the big Anglo corporate ranchers, re-steal, retake cattle that they claim was their own and stolen from them. And but then the corporate ranchers and farmers began employing officers of the law, and most infamous were the Texas Rangers as far as their treatment, their separate, discriminatory, ruthless treatment of Mexican Americans. They went after them with gusto, according to the sources I've read. And so like Cheno Cortina and others, he raided Brownsville, Texas, and the Rangers went after him with a vengeance to kill, not just arrest, but to kill him. And so Mexican Americans, they sometimes acquiesce to the terms that have been imposed upon them and just working their bottoms off on a day-to-day basis, migrating in seasonal jobs of farming, railroads, and et cetera, that would last usually just for a few months at a time. They'd have to go on the road and move to find the next job. And of course, that's going to be a common theme throughout the early 1900s still. And they also did well, again, as we mentioned when we covered the West, in retaining their culture. They retained their culture, their language, their Catholic Christianity, their Hispanic mores of right and wrong, traditions, very effectively. Even when there was miscegenation, when there was a Mexican American married an Anglo American, they taught their kids rather successfully to continue their culture. But and then sometimes they fought within and beyond the system. And we went over that the week before our break with the West, of them running for office. Esteban Ochoa of Tucson, Arizona. Some of the members of the Santa Fe Ring were well-to-do Mexican Americans who did well for themselves. San Antonio created an intelligentsia and educated middle class of Hispanic men in particular. And then they fought beyond the system, like Cheno Cortina and the Gorras Blancas, and fighting back against the big farmers and ranchers, etc. But it was not easy for them. So you see, there was a lot of concentration on this section of conflict history, right? Of winners and losers, and the writer trying to elicit your empathy for those who suffered, for the victims. And of course, the victims in this section are the Mexican Americans. All right. So do you have any questions?
Yeah, so you want us to write about each section?
No, hon, what I want you to do is just write on this section right here. Maybe what I'll do is put that out in a put that out in an announcement to make sure that's clear. The American History Gilded Age assignment that I plan on putting up, that simply is just to read, to give you context of what was going on at that time. So yeah, your written and submitted analysis and evaluation, I'd like it to be just on this.
Okay. And is there a specific writing style for the way we'll be writing it?
Not at all. You could write in the first person. You could write informally. I believe to me, this is a history class and not an English class. What I'm looking is for the intelligence of your points and how well you support those points.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay. So yeah, that's it. Okay. I wish you well on this. I'm happy to give you your extra credit, Jasmine. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So have a good week. Okay, Jasmine?
Okay, you too.
All right. Thank you. Will do. Bye-bye.